today's talk, what's it all about? The descent of rules. So the title is punning a bit on the theme of this seminar series, which has been a fantastic seminar series, celebrating 150 years of the descent of man. So in this talk, I want to talk about how we can apply evolutionary theory to the study of institutions, and which are kinds of rules, as we'll talk about in a minute. So I'm going to start off by introducing what we mean by institutions and their role in organizing human societies, and talk a bit about variation of institutions in space and time. I'm going to talk about how we can try and connect institutions and evolutionary theory. And then for the most of the talk, I'll be talking about some of the tests of hypotheses about institutional evolution that myself and my research group have been doing, thinking about the studies we can do at a kind of a global or macro scale. And then towards the end, I'll focus a bit on some more recent work, thinking about how we can model institutional change at a more micro level. And then at the end, think about how we can, or discuss how we're applying some of this work to the issue of community-based conservation in Kenya. And for those interested, most of what I'll be talking about today comes from a paper that's just been accepted in Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, and also a book chapter that I wrote about 5 years ago now with Pete, who's one of the co-authors on that, coming out of an Ernst Strungman forum where we sat around for a few days and discussed how evolutionary theory and complexity theory might apply to institutions. And I guess a kind of an intellectual successor to that endeavor is this new edited volume that will be coming out at some point in the future. We're just kind of collating chapters and reviewing them at the moment. But it's a collaborative effort with Sergey, Pete, and some political scientists and economists. So this is a very interdisciplinary field of research. And institutions, what are we talking about? So institutions is one of these terms that has kind of lots of different meanings in colloquial speech. But to guide us to think about what we're talking about, we can adopt this kind of working definition, the idea that institutions, what we're talking about, are systems of rules which prescribe particular roles and regulate social relationships. And our life is, filled with these kind of these institutions. We're surrounded, we engage with institutions and rules, and we often probably take them for granted. So we're thinking about things like marriage, or in traditional societies, descent and inheritance, kinship, the kind of things Fiona Jordan was talking about a few weeks ago. We can also think about kind of law courts or parliaments, or kind of the kind of more formal rules that and laws that govern our lives, but it also applies to things like banking, basically anything that involves regular interactions with people. We have rules and institutions that set the scene for how those things work. So institutions basically organize societies, and they help groups act collectively. And they do this by structuring interactions and affecting payoffs to different behaviors. I just need to go back a second. And another thing that's going to kind of come up, so in some of the fields of social science that talk about institutions are often thought about something distinct from other aspects of culture, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. What I want to do, kind of in the theme of this very broad-based seminar series, is link institutions to something that's kind of studied across species. So as far as we can tell, it's only really humans that have institutions, because they're kind of based on language and probably some cognitive aspects that other species don't have. But when we kind of compare human societies to other species, there's kind of a big factor is that we're kind of an extremely cooperative species. We're kind of, we have groups that are kind of cohesively organized in very large numbers. There are, of course, other species that are also very cooperative, but often this is kind of based around some form of cooperative breeding or involving kind of, higher levels of relatedness with other individuals. In humans, we're a bit weird, we're a bit different, and we have these kind of interactions and cooperative situations with people that we're not related to at all, and in very large numbers. So that's the kind of picture that you see when biologists think about cooperation. But social scientists might often have a different view. So looking at kind of the spread, the variance that there is in humans in terms of cooperation and how cohesive or societies are organized collectively, there's a huge amount of variation. And actually, human cooperation, large-scale organization, is actually very difficult to achieve. So anybody who's ever tried to organize or get more than a few people to do something knows it's very, very difficult, especially if they're academics. It's like herding cats most of the time. So it's something that's difficult to do, but we think that kind of the key to how it is achieved is through institutions. And political scientists or economists will often distinguish between what they might think about as good or bad institutions. And so people like Acemoglu and Robinson have kind of come up with schemes where they talk about kind of good institutions as being ones that involve large, the majority of the population are allowed to be involved in political and economic decision making. And they contrast that with kind of what they call extractive institutions, where basically it's a small minority, a kind of elite of individuals who make decisions, political and economic, and unsurprisingly, they tend to make decisions that are good for them and not necessarily good for everyone. And just this example here is kind of cotton picking in the Ukraine, where young children are kind of taken out of school and have to have to kind of farm cotton when they should be at school learning. And that benefits kind of elites, according to the studies of Acemoglu and Robinson and others. Another example of this, and one of the reasons that people kind of point to institutions being a key factor apart from other aspects of culture. You can look to kind of what they call natural experiments in history. So here we have a picture of the Korean peninsula at nighttime. So it's dark, apart from all the white dots there, which are night lights basically. So these are kind of an indication of economic development. And what you can kind of clearly see is that the border that separates North Korea and South Korea is very clearly able to be seen in this picture, which points to kind of very divergent pathways that have been taken amongst a population that was kind of fairly uniform culturally prior to the splitting of North and South Korea after the Korean War and the kind of the establishment of communist institutions in the northern half, which have not led to economic growth in the same way as they have in the south. And kind of more globally, this kind of pattern seems to be obvious. So political scientists and others kind of come up with various indices in which to kind of measure how well a country is doing, how good its institutions are, how inclusive they are, and there seems to be kind of quite a tight relationship. So the better the institutions, then the kind of the better economic growth and economic performance is. So it's kind of just to kind of show that they on this scale. So on the y-axis, their higher values indicate kind of more or worse institutions, and kind of more of these kind of indicators of being a failed state. We can also look at institutions in longer term historical context, and when we kind of think about the longer term cultural evolution of humans. We think that kind of for most of human history, hunter-gatherer, we subsisted as hunter-gatherers. We were organized on a fairly small scale. We didn't have kind of very large populations with large population densities. This is the kind of the classic model that Manveer Singh last week was pushing against, and he's absolutely right that there's more variation in kind of hunter-gatherer organization than kind of simple models often account for. We do kind of get instances of some larger hunter-gatherer groups with more population densities and different kind of complex relationships. But as we kind of talked about last week in the discussion section, there's nothing in the historical or archaeological record which points to something on the scale of the kind of state level societies that kind of dominate the world today. And so we kind of look to my home country of Britain. And then we're kind of characterized by kind of quite complex forms of political organization. We have lots of people who are specialists in different things. We have specialist lawmakers. We have parliaments that make laws. We also have very high population densities. We have formal systems of money that kind of regulate our economic activities. We also have inequalities in our society, structured by social class and economics, but also hereditary principles are maintained in this country as well, in other parts of the world. So there's been a change, and there's been a kind of an increase in the scale of human societies, and also in the sheer kind of number and form of different institutions that we have to organize these societies. And this is something that we can kind of demonstrate empirically. So Pete referenced the SESHAT database that I was involved with in the past, where the aim is to kind of systematize, I guess, to kind of help organize studies of history and archaeology, and kind of facilitate comparative analysis. This is kind of a large scale project that aims to kind of understand kind of global history as far back as we can go, but in this case, going back as far as kind of the last 10,000 years since the kind of the real beginnings of food production and agriculture. And the kind of the first main study that was done as part of this project was to basically kind of quantify the evolution of social political complexity over time, over the last kind of 10,000 years or so. It's a massive project and involved working with lots of historians and archaeologists, specialists in different parts of the world. And so in this study, we looked at kind of 30 different points around the world, and tried to kind of interrogate the available historical and archaeological data and understand how different aspects of society have changed over time. And what we found was we kind of examined a number of different dimensions of society. So we looked at various aspects relating to the scale of human societies, so things to do with population size, territory, and things to do with kind of population densities in terms of how many people are in capital cities, things like that, levels of hierarchical organization within those societies, and various different kind of features of institutions or other things that kind of potentially help structure societies. And we kind of created a code book that basically tried to categorize different elements of society, and then going through the historical and archaeological literatures, find evidence of presence or absence of different features. And the kind of the take-home story of this study was that we found that basically all these different aspects of society are very, very tightly linked, and they seem to kind of evolve together. So this kind of spider's web diagram has lots of different lines, and each of those lines indicates some kind of statistically significant association between these potentially different elements of society. And so we argue that this is evidence that we can kind of usefully categorize something called social political complexity as some kind of real dimension that can be used to kind of, that can be measured across different societies. And we talk about it as a kind of a composite measure of the various roles, institutions, and technologies that enable the coordination of large numbers of people to act in a politically unified manner. So basically the argument is that if you don't have these various things that kind of help structure your society, once you get beyond a certain size, then basically you can't work efficiently, and you can't coordinate things properly. So that's a kind of a big picture of what we're talking about here. So the study of institutions has been something that's kind of been the domain mainly of the mainstream social sciences. It's been something that's kind of studied in economics or political science, or in different ways in anthropology and other related disciplines. But there's kind of, so there's lots of literature, and it's all spread around in different places. And what we want to do is to be able to kind of understand a bit more about the general processes that affect how institutions change over time, and kind of want to be able to use evolutionary theory here as a kind of what we call a synthetic framework, to be able to bring together the insights from different disciplines. Try and see the whole of the elephant, if you kind of get that metaphor. And kind of the point of contact with this is to kind of understand what we're talking about when we're talking about evolutionary theory. So Darwin talked about evolution as descent with modification. And today we might talk about processes of variation, inheritance, and if there are certain conditions that hold, then we can see processes of selection. And so people like Pete and other authors who kind of pioneered the field of cultural evolutionary studies have argued that these principles apply to culture as much as they do to biological features. And so we can make the argument that they also apply to institutions as well. And so when we're talking about institutions evolving, we can recognize the idea that rules are transmitted down generations, so there's inheritance going on. Rules can be modified, so that leads to variation. But it's not necessarily the same way that variation is generated in biological systems. So as has been kind of brought up in discussions and in previous seminars, as humans, we can kind of actively plan changes in societies, and we can sometimes see discontinuous changes in institutions. But oftentimes, actually, when we're looking at kind of institutional change, often we're building on existing elements of societies, existing elements of culture. So it's not necessarily we're kind of completely inventing things from scratch. Even sometimes when it looks like there's a big change in a society. Often that's involving adopting something from another society or adapting it from somewhere else. So the kind of good example of that is when Japan opened up to the West in the 1800s after several hundred years of isolation. Then they adopted lots of forms of kind of Western societies at that time, but they also adapted them to incorporate elements of traditional Japanese society as well. But also, even though we can kind of think we're intelligent and we think we can kind of plan things out and kind of consciously design things, we're not always very good at doing this. As anybody frustrated with political systems knows, they don't always go to plan, or they don't always serve everybody's best interests. And so these things still need to kind of play out, and there can still be processes that affect how we get to better solutions to problems. And sometimes people talk about institutions in the sense of stable patterns of group behavior, and people in these seminar series have talked about kind of equilibria. And if you do get stable patterns of group level behavior, then what you can get is selection between groups. So if there's competition between groups, and then you've got some group level behaviors that enable other groups or enable groups to outcompete other groups, then those are the features that will spread and become more common over time. So rather than be too narrow in this kind of conceptual mapping between biological evolution and institutional evolution, then we can ask more generally kind of what are the actual general processes that affect institutional evolution. And it's worth pointing out, and I'll talk about this a bit more towards the end, that institutions, as the way they actually come about, how change occurs, and is something that's probably a bit underdeveloped in our current models and current understanding. But I'm going to start off with some examples, and I'm going to focus on initially some macro scale studies of institutional evolution. So going back to that kind of historical database study, so this is one of the examples of the results that we got, kind of tracing social political complexity over time, and this is our composite measure of complexity over time. So there's kind of a few patterns that we can kind of pick out with that, in that, so kind of the first major pattern is that you kind of go from the left towards the right, then you're generally seeing larger numbers, so more complex societies as we move closer to the present. So there's this kind of trend going on, but it's not a uniform trend. There's peaks and troughs. There's kind of periods of kind of apparent stability. So there's something going on there. There's a general trend towards increasing complexity over time. But there's nothing given about that. There's nothing kind of, societies don't necessarily always get more complex. There's plenty of examples of societies collapsing. It's kind of popularized in Jared Diamond's book, and we kind of, if some of the tendencies that we're seeing in the world today, then my own country has exited a large cooperative collection of countries, and there are all these different pressures in different parts of the world, and sometimes we're seeing groups fall apart as well. So there's this trend going on, but there's also evidence that things don't always increase over time. So we see similar kinds of patterns when we look at the kind of the long-term evolution of biological complexity. So biological life started out as kind of single-celled organisms, and then gradually has become more complex over time. You get multicellular organisms. We start getting combinations of different species coming together, creating the organelles in our own cells. We get kind of more larger scale, more complex forms of organization in biology. And biologists studying evolutionary trends have made a distinction between different types of evolutionary trends, or different possible ways that we might see evolutionary trends. The trends could, if we just look at what, the kind of, if we look at the top of these figures here, we see kind of distributions, frequency distributions. So on the passive side, what we see is that kind of in this kind of present day, we'll see kind of most species are kind of not very complex. If we think about the x-axis as indicating complexity, and species starting out as not very complex, and over time you've seen some species have become more complex, but there's still a lot of not very complex species out there. Our world still contains lots of single-celled organisms and things like viruses that can still have a large impact in the world today, unfortunately. And we can kind of contrast that kind of pattern or that kind of process with a more driven evolutionary process, where you're not only seeing an increase in the most complex forms of life, but you're also seeing a reduction in the simpler forms. And so what you're seeing is kind of a shift of the whole distribution over time. So there's some, in this case, there's some active force that's kind of acting across all levels of organization here that kind of leads to this driven trend mechanism. So when we think about, we can try and apply this to human socio-political complexity as well. So if we think about human societies starting off at fairly low levels of complexity, small scale, not as many kind of institutions governing them, then what do we see just this kind of increase? We've seen an increase in the scale and complexity of societies. Is that just an increase in the right tail of the distribution? So we can take those data that we talked about, kind of the historical database, which tracks these changes over time. And what we see, I think, is something, so if we look at population size changing over time, or measures of kind of government complexity, or measures of number of hierarchical levels, what we see is, we see this shift in the right tail of these distributions. So, but we're seeing a reduction in the left-hand tail. So we're seeing this kind of shift of the whole distribution towards more complex societies. And another test we can do of that is to kind of look to see, how many, even in a kind of a driven evolutionary process, we'd expect to see more increases in complexity than decreases. And when we kind of look in different regions of the world, then the overall pattern is that in the vast majority of different regions in the world, then there's been more transitions to more complex societies than there have been reductions in society in complexity. So there seems to be kind of evidence here for this kind of driven evolutionary process. So the question then is, well, what is potentially driving the evolution of political complexity in human societies? And one potential candidate is the idea that warfare, kind of direct competition between groups, might be driving this. And so this is an idea that's kind of been popularized and kind of proposed, particularly by Peter Turchin, in books like War and Peace and War. And kind of if we look historically, then he's argued that one of kind of the biggest causes of conflict kind of that we can kind of see in the historical record is with kind of the invention of horse-based forms of warfare technology, so chariots and cavalry. What we saw was a kind of a ramping up of the intensity of warfare in historical record. And he argued this is kind of what has driven the evolution of large-scale societies. The kind of the first weapons of mass destruction. I think Peter talks about that. And so a few years ago, Peter and Sergey began kind of developing models about this process and kind of approached me to kind of help out with trying to test some of these models against data. And so this resulted in a paper that came out in PNAS a few years ago now. So we developed a model that basically, broadly speaking, we kind of think about this grid on the right-hand side here as each of these grid cells represents a different society, and we allow these kind of societies to fight each other, and we allow kind of one group to kind of take over and control another one. Then we can kind of see the emergence of larger scale societies. And so kind of these multi-group polities, we can talk about them there, are kind of shown there in the red and the blue. And then we also allowed, so then if you go from the top grid to the bottom grid, that represents a different time step. And what you can see is that the blue polity has fought with the green one, and it's bigger, and so it's kind of it's won the battle and incorporated it. But we also allowed for these polities to break apart. And we modeled the role that institutions might play in this process. So that kind of string of zeros in the bottom represents a kind of an abstract series of the presence or absence of different institutions, different traits that these societies might have. And we allowed a kind of, our societies to develop these traits. If they became present, then they were represented as 1, and if they were absent, they were 0. And we kind of a feature of the model is that it was much easier to lose these traits than it was to develop them. And what we did was kind of ran this model on a kind of a representation of the world, of the old world, and we tried to match the outputs from this simulation to real historical data about the kind of the distribution of large-scale societies during this 3,000 year period of human history. So 1,500 BCE to 1,500 CE or AD. And so we ran the model, and we tested different parameters, and different combinations of processes, and we kind of modeled the spread of this warfare technology kind of coming out from the steppe, which kind of influenced the intensity of competition between groups. And these figures here kind of break down our results into different time periods. So on the right, you have the model simulations, and on the left, you have the kind of corresponding historical data from the same period. And basically, it's kind of a heat map. So where you're seeing red is where there are kind of larger scale societies were formed during these periods. And what we see is that kind of the output from the model shows a pretty good match to the historical data. So that's a kind of a test of the kind of the underlying logic of this idea. So it kind of seems to make sense, and it also seems to kind of match the historical record fairly well as well. So it's important to do when you're doing this kind of work. We can kind of come up with lots of different ideas, and lots of people do have different hypotheses. And I think it's always important to try and test different ideas, test different hypotheses, and trying, that was kind of a big feature of all the work that I do. In this kind of follow-up paper that kind of came out last year, we attempted to do this using statistical analysis, looking at different predictors of the same data we used in that previous paper. So in that previous paper, we were obviously focused on this idea of warfare as this kind of selective force, but it's also, matching up to evolutionary theory still. There are going to be other factors that might affect the evolution of large-scale societies, including things that might affect the generation of variation, the generation of institutions that enable large-scale society. And a big one that we think is important, that everybody talks about in the literature, is agriculture. So it's the thought that kind of agriculture provides this resource base that facilitates large complex societies, and people have different ideas about how exactly that works, but there's this kind of common understanding that agriculture is important. We examined two factors relating to agriculture. We looked at the duration of agriculture, and we also looked at the productivity of agriculture, the potential productivity. So the idea here is that if agriculture has been going for longer in different parts of the world, there's basically been more time for larger scale societies to develop, independent of anything to do with differences in warfare intensity, and then also potential productivity. It might be the case that more productive societies are more conducive, more productive environments are more conducive to larger scale societies. So these are hypotheses that need to be tested. So we collated data relating to these hypotheses. So we kind of used distance from the steppe as our proxy for the spread of military technology, horse-based military technology. That's what we'd used in the model previously. And we also collated data on the duration of agriculture, and that involved doing a lot of work to kind of track down data on archaeological studies and kind of basically create maps of how agriculture spread out from different sources, different parts of the world. And again, we kind of see these heat maps here kind of representing these data. We also were able to come up with a proxy for potential agricultural productivity so kind of the greener areas on that third map down relate to areas that kind of crop models tell us are more productive. And at the end, we've got a measure of terrain ruggedness as a kind of a control variable. So it might be that kind of more mountainous, rugged terrain is not very good for the emergence of large-scale societies. And what we can see on the patterns on the left there show the relationship between these variables and our output measure of imperial density. So kind of, how frequent were large-scale societies in different parts of the world. And we see for distance from the steppe, our warfare measure, we see this relationship. So the further away you get from the steppe, the less frequently large-scale societies occurred. And then also with duration of agriculture, the areas that have a longer duration of agriculture are the areas where large-scale societies were more common throughout history. There doesn't appear to be any kind of relationship going on here with agricultural productivity and ruggedness of terrain. And we performed a number of different statistical analyses to kind of test different ideas, different combinations of parameters. And it was basically the key take-home message is that those two variables, so duration of agriculture and distance from the steppe, were the best fitting explanations. And also there's an interaction between those two as well. So areas that have had agriculture for longer and that have experienced warfare kind of have even more large scale societies. And the maps at the bottom there kind of show the data we were trying to explain, these composite maps of the distribution of large-scale societies, and then the distribution predicted by our model, our statistical model, and you can kind of see similar patterns. But also, it's not a perfect fit; it doesn't explain all the variation that there is. There are parts of the world where we seem to kind of underpredict or overpredict the emergence of these kind of societies. So there's different factors that go on, and there might be different things going on in different regions that we need to account for. We can also kind of take this perspective and think about how these processes might have shaped history and kind of created the world we live in today. So as we've kind of talked about, economists talk about this kind of relationship between institutions and kind of economic growth. And it's an unfortunate fact of the world today that there's a huge disparity in economic outcomes around the world. And some economists have kind of begun to tackle the idea that actually the roots of some of this economic inequality kind of go back in history for various different reasons. I had a PhD student, Adam Flitton, who looked at this during his PhD, and we wanted to kind of test different ideas. So we looked at the literature, and we kind of, there's a vast number of different ideas that kind of link economic outcomes to various factors to do with history or social factors or even kind of ecological factors, and they vary as to whether they envisage some kind of direct effect of these different variables on modern day outcomes. And so we try to represent this in the form of this kind of path diagram. So each of these arrows here represents some kind of hypothesis that somebody in the literature has proposed. There's 24 different hypotheses here. It's not the easiest of papers to write when you've got 24 different hypotheses to try and explain to reviewers. So it's still under review. But the results, the findings that we've got from this work seem to tell us that once we analyze these data, which come from kind of country level data that people have assembled over the years, these are the relationships that we find statistical support for. So we haven't got a particular favored hypothesis. We're allowing the data to tell us what are the relationships that are present in it. And so what we see, if we think about latitude as some kind of catch-all proxy for various different ecological factors, what we see is this kind of main pathway that seems to occur of latitude. Ecological factors affected where the agricultural transitions that happened in the past. So they seem to happen kind of more in the mid-latitudes. That in turn, as we saw in the last study, but this is independent data from that, that affects kind of the evolution of large complex societies. That in turn has impacted whether societies today have these kind of good institutions. And so theorists talk about the importance of kind of, centralization in having kind of good institutions. It's not the only factor, but so kind of having a previous history of developed centralized institutions can affect modern day institutional quality, which is the thing that has the most, the biggest direct effect on modern day gross domestic product. It's not the only kind of pathway that's going on. So we also kind of know that ecological factors affect where Europeans settled, to affect the kind of the history of colonialism, and that can affect kind of the features, the kind of the social capital of populations, or kind of cultural features to do with kind of how much societies favour the in-group versus kind of being more kind of wider in the scope in which they kind of favour relationships. And so these kind of studies also point to the importance of kind of knocking out hypotheses as well. So last of these studies that I'll talk about looks at the spread of one particularly important collection of good institutions that we talk about. So the kind of modern democratic institutions. The idea is that you involve the majority of the population in decision making. And and this, think about this happening through voting and other forms of kind of political representation. And kind of modern democracies kind of stem in many ways from the kind of the American tradition. And we can kind of see the spread of democracy to other countries after it was kind of adopted in America. It's not to say it's the first democracy in human history, or there aren't kind of elements of democracies in other parts of the world. But in the particular data set that we're looking at, which is the Polity 5 database, it provides a measure of the kind of the degree of democratic institutions that different societies have had over time. And we can kind of trace when different countries changed their kind of these political institutions. And so these dots on this graph here represent the time of adoption is on the y-axis there. And this is kind of the most recent adoption of democratic institutions. So some countries have kind of gone back and forth between kind of adopting democratic institutions and then becoming less democratic. So these are kind of the last times when these things occurred. And then on the right, we've got a language phylogeny. So the idea here is that there's some kind of, we can measure kind of how close different countries are culturally. And here we're testing the idea kind of born out of evolutionary theory that institutions or other aspects of culture might more easily spread between related cultures or related countries. And we're using language relationships here to proxy for that. So, so in these data anyway, so there seems to be a relationship between the countries that are kind of more closely related to the USA in this sample are the ones that adopted democratic institutions earlier. So I'm going to wrap up in the last few minutes talking at this idea that I kind of flagged up earlier in the talk, the idea that in kind of our current cultural evolutionary framework, we don't necessarily have kind of well-developed models of how institutions change in terms of the processes that we model. Most of the kind of the models of cultural evolution are based on kind of individual level transmission of cultural traits, and that's really important for lots of different things, but it's not really capturing some of the fundamental social processes. And so recently, some people have been turning towards game theory as a way of modeling this. I'm not going to get into this too much, but it's kind of a standard game theory kind of approach, such as the classic prisoner's dilemma game. We think about kind of cooperation. The normal way these things are handled is that it's very kind of difficult to get individuals to cooperate in one-shot situations, because there's always you can always do better by defecting, by not cooperating, and that's kind of, that applies that to kind of real world situations in the kind of the tragedy of the commons, or the kind of provision of public goods and things like that. So people like Simon Powers and Lauren Lehman have argued kind of a way to model institutions can be that if we think about institutions as this kind of political game that happens before the economic game, we can kind of model the process whereby humans kind of create rules and understandings that affect the payoffs in that kind of standard economic game. And we can create rules, we can institute things like punishment or other things, create incentives for cooperating, or structure interactions so that cooperators tend to interact more with cooperators, so that we change those kind of that basic structure and payoff in the economic game and favor cooperation. So recently, one of my postdocs, Marco Campani, and I have kind of developed a kind of a toy model to kind of illustrate this process, where we kind of created a public goods game in a simulation, and we had cooperators and defectors. And we had a political game whereby the agents were able to introduce some level of punishment into the system. So the system started without any punishment, and under those conditions, defection is favoured and you don't get cooperators. But if the agents can vote amongst themselves to introduce punishment, and they can kind of set that level of punishment through some kind of interaction, then what you can see is that affects the payoffs, the budgets that agents get in kind of playing this public goods game, and over time that leads to kind of cooperators being favoured and kind of cooperation winning out. So this is kind of admittedly a very kind of toy model, and kind of it has lots of features that are not ideal, but other people have been developing more sophisticated versions of this kind of approach. So Sergey's done a whole bunch of really cool papers recently, and introducing things like leadership, punishment, and the ability to have foresight, to kind of look ahead, to think about how people might be affected by different rules, and introduce different kind of modes of selection. So we can introduce group selection, which might favour cooperation as well. And then we have people like Cedric Perrett, who's now a postdoc in my lab as well, been looking at other things to do with leadership and decision making, and so people are beginning to kind of develop these kind of models that allow for kind of the emergence of cooperation through the kind of establishment of different institutions. And then the very final thing I'm going to talk about is kind of the most recent work that I'm doing, and kind of where I'm spending a lot of my my thoughts processes at the moment, is thinking about how we can apply evolutionary approaches on these kind of issues to address real world challenges. And for the last few years, I've been working with systems in northern Kenya, what we call community-based conservation systems, whereby kind of groups of pastoralists, in this case, are kind of coming together and managing their land collectively for the kind of the dual purposes of wildlife conservation and also for kind of for creating better pasture for their livestock and to kind of maintain their livelihoods. Because both wildlife and livestock in the system both depend on the same underlying feature, which is grass. And this, all these things fit nicely with UN Sustainable Development Goals. And one of the UN Sustainable Development Goals is to kind of promote strong institutions, effective institutions for managing these kind of common pool resources in this case. And my postdoc, Lindsay Walker, has been heading up a lot of the field work we've been doing. So I don't at the moment have any kind of results to show from this, and kind of COVID has impacted our kind of our best laid plans to do some of this work. That's just a kind of a map of the conservancy. So we're kind of up in the kind of the middle part, which is the northern part of Kenya, in cultural geographic terms. Similar part of the world to kind of where Sarah Matthew was working in her talk from a while ago. But we've got measures of the institutions of these different conservancies, how well they're being governed according to different metrics, and we're kind of collating data on particular design features of these institutions, and at the moment looking to map those to real-world conservancy outcomes. And at the moment, I'm writing kind of a big grant and kind of develop the next big step in this work. So I'm going to finish off there. So what I want to say is that basically cultural evolutionary theory provides, I think, a synthetic framework to study institutional change. It allows us to generate hypotheses, and we can test those empirically. The analyses that we've done seem to suggest that competition between groups is kind of a candidate for driving the evolution of large-scale societies. It's not been the only thing. There's been other factors that have affected this evolution. But we also can see how cultural evolutionary history has shaped the distribution of institutions and economic performance that we see in the modern world today. But there's lots of work to be done, lots of really cool avenues to explore, to kind of take this work to the next step, and potentially think about how we can apply this to address the many, many challenges we have in the world today. So I'm going to leave it there. Just thank these various bodies for giving me money and my research team for doing this work. So thank you very much. I'll stop sharing my screen there.
Thank you, Tom. That was a great talk. We are going to give people a chance to enter some questions into the Q&A. And to start it off, I'll ask a quick question. Geography has been, and GIS has been, an interest of mine. And you touched on landscape and its impact on the political institutions and transportations, and at times didn't. How do you see that as creating niches for these various little political and cultural sort of groups?
Yes, yeah. So it's kind of, I guess, the take-home message from our analyses that we didn't see an effect of landscape in that, but that doesn't mean that it hasn't been important. It just might mean that it's either on the scale we're looking at, it's not coming out. We know with kind of geographical ecological processes, these things can work at different scales, and you can kind of detect patterns at different scales. There's interesting work in kind of political anthropology. This is something kind of Peter Turchin kind of flags up a lot. There's this area, it's called Zomia. And this kind of, it's talked about as this kind of in political anarchic terms, or kind of it's areas where they think that kind of large scale societies haven't been able to reach, and they're areas where kind of or they're kind of refugia sometimes for people trying to escape some of the effects of kind of the inequalities seen in large-scale societies. So I definitely think that it's we can kind of detect these effects, and there's definitely impacts of that kind of landscape on societies, and we often I think we see that at more local scales as well. And it's, so there's as I said, alluded to in the talk, there's areas when we look at them, kind of the match between the model and the data, there are areas that kind of chronically under or overfit, and those are kind of areas where we can kind of explore what's going on. So there's always there's a role for more traditional historical or kind of path dependent explanations in this stuff as well. So none of these general explanations ever fit every single case perfectly and explain everything. You should always be suspicious if somebody tells you they do.
There was a question early on with regard to Smaldino's defining group level traits as phenotypic results of group organization, and whether this carries implications that cultural group selection does not act directly on institution norms, etc. You can, I don't know if you have the Q&A open, Tom, but you can click on it at the bottom and see some of these questions as well. The greatest norms for cooperation won't function if people don't cooperate, which means that it's important to study ways of manufacturing consent that takes place in society.
So I think this gets to the point that I was making kind of towards the end. This is this kind of distinction between the micro level processes, what's going on in societies that kind of allow for these kind of institutions to emerge. So kind of cultural group selection is kind of can be one way that kind of I guess the kind of frequency of different forms of different institutions could change, but it's probably going to be quite a slow process compared to what kind of goes on, the kind of interactions between different individuals. So we need to kind of basically kind of be approaching these things from both directions, kind of thinking about, how our institutions, how do they emerge from these kind of bottom-up processes, from the interactions between individuals, and something I didn't really talk about in that kind of political game thing was the kind of more interesting political games is when you've got differences between individuals, and you've got differences in kind of power and status, and different people can affect the game in different ways. So that's important, but then we shouldn't also then ignore the group level effects on that, and the kind of the processes, what Smaldino talks about as these kind of emergent properties at the group level. But I think also as well, you can't ignore the effects of things happening at the group level in terms of the path that the institutions take as well. Kind of people might construct institutions that are designed to be better in between group competition as well. So we've got to work on all these levels.
Let's take one more from online, and then I'll ask the panelists if they have any questions. But there's a question here. Institutions are characterized both by the explicit formal rules by which they normally operate, as well as the implicit formal rules by which they may actually operate. How does this difference affect the evolution of institutions? And might I add also the rate at which these two change may be different?
Yeah. So that's from Dennis. That's a really good question, and a really important one. And so that is kind of that's something that kind of needs to be kind of addressed further. So in the studies that I was talking about, so we've got this idea that kind of how institutions play out is not only affected by specific rules, but by kind of the other elements of culture that play into it. And there's some nice examples. So Jenna Bednar, who's a political scientist that we collaborate with, kind of has this nice example of particular rules in the kind of constitutions of the USA and Mexico. They're exactly the same in terms of how they're written on paper, but they're used completely differently, and they play out in very, very different ways. So these things so that can affect how institutional rules play out. There is potential for institutional rules to affect norms. So there's a kind of a two-way potential process. So in that kind of historical study of the spread of democracy, for example, one of the arguments there is that because of these other elements of culture, that's the thing that's affecting the kind of the rate of spread of democracy, in this case, to cultures that are more closely related. So the idea, if you've got all this other cultural stuff that might affect how the rules play out, then kind of a new institution from one culture is going to be probably more likely to be suited to the existing other aspects of culture in other countries. So that's the kind of the idea. That's where we kind of try and incorporate that element of kind of shared cultural history into that to kind of to see how these things work. And also in the economics study as well, we've got norms there to do with kind of in-group bias that we have. In that case, we've got them kind of affecting kind of how effective institutions are in effect. So, but yeah, it's something that needs to be modelled more as well, and it's something that kind of Sergey is modelling, and our group is hoping to model more explicitly in the future as well.
Louise, did you have a question?
I did, Eric. Thanks, Tom. That was wonderful. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about how external information storage and processing affect the evolution of institutions.
Yeah. So I get. So are you talking about kind of being able to write stuff down? Yeah. So I mean, in the historical kind of the big long-term historical database study, that kind of we had measures of that kind of information technology in there, and so that seems to be something that is also kind of increasing as societies increase. So I think actually it's probably really important in affecting these things. I suspect it's probably kind of quite important for stabilizing things, because when you have that method of kind of keeping track of the rules, and we know from other studies in kind of cultural evolution that kind of if things aren't used much, then they tend to drop out of kind of cultural repertoires, right? So actually having that kind of external storage means things don't have to be stored in people's brains. They can be written down, people can rediscover them, and I think we see that in fields of scientific activity, right? We're always building on what other people and finding new discoveries, and so example in this paper, that modeling approach of the kind of political game and the economic game, that was something that was developed in economics in the 90s, and probably stuff to do in the 80s beforehand, but people hadn't run with it, but it gets picked up, and we see these kind of cycles, right, going on with things. So I think it has a big impact, and it'd be interesting to kind of look at whether it has this kind of stabilizing influence. Although having said that, as that kind of example I talked about, just because something's written down doesn't mean that it gets interpreted the same way.
That's sort of what prompted it, really, that you can have things written down, and then does how you write them down start to change in order to make them more effective, and that kind of thing. Well, that's always, that's kind of always interesting, right, from us Brits, when you go to the, they have this constitution written down, whereas we've muddled through with stuff on liniment and kind of ox skin and all this kind of stuff, and and it's designed for some expert who says he knows about everything. And
if you're wearing a wig, you have to take notice of someone.
Exactly.
Thanks a lot.
Pete, did you have?
So Tom, a very nice talk, by the way. It seems to me one of the prominent macroevolutionary patterns in the last 10,000 years is that different regions go through a period where they're the most creative region, but that region shifts all over the old world. So the earliest political developments were in Mesopotamia and Egypt, and later on during the Islamic Golden Age, that same region was precocious, and Tang and Song dynasty China went through their periods of leading technological evolution, for example. Sometime, I don't know when, the Indians became very creative with respect to textiles and things like that. And in the West, we tend to brag about the West, but the West was no place until it was someplace, and now it's someplace. Now it's the leading set of countries in technical evolution and political evolution, but it shifts around. Does anybody? I know that pattern goes back. At least I was exposed to it reading a history book by William McNeill back in the 60s or 70s, but it doesn't receive nearly as much attention as it seems to me it deserves.
So that's a really interesting point, and I don't kind of have a good catch-all answer, but my first thoughts are to kind of think about some of Peter Turchin's ideas of these cycles in how societies do, and kind of how they do well initially, and then kind of inequality builds up, and that affects cohesiveness, and then societies collapse. So I think that's probably part of the story. Then I guess what we're talking about here is that kind of process playing out in a network, right? Or potentially happening in a network, and the features of that network having important implications and effects on how these things play out. So if you imagine you've got one society that's doing well at one point, that starts to kind of collapse and do well, and as long as there's kind of other societies around it, they might have learned some of the advances that have been made. So some of the institutions or technologies might have spread out from there. Then they're in a position, you have power vacuums that are created. Then they're in a position to kind of take over. And so I think that's probably part of the process. And again, what you've got, and then in world history as it actually played out, is that you've got kind of the old world kind of being connected, right? Initially is not connected, and then it gets connected as societies get bigger, and you get kind of trade networks and all this kind of stuff. So that kind of goes a bit to Lou's point about kind of how information is stored, and kind of, so I think what's happening is there you've got kind of information kind of being stored in this kind of the global system, and I've got a dim recollection of some studies, and I think there might be some Russian scholars, Sergei might be able to kind of say more to it, that have kind of looked at these kind of effects of things like, the Silk Road on the kind of transmission of information that kind of affects these things. But the details are kind of fuzzy at the moment. Sergei.
Yeah, I have a question, or maybe a comment about selective forces. You emphasized cultural group selection, and you also said that humans are not too good in designing things. And I know our people share with you. Speed here, he's written the whole article, and Joe Carrick has been emphasizing that. But kind of, I think it's a bit one-sided view. Even if we are not perfect in designing things, a little bit of design will take you a long way away. Moreover, I mean, rules and institutions were designed by people who have power. And if you look at history, even at modern history, you'll find plenty of examples of successful institutions whose designers were driven by ideology or by religion, or just by desire to protect the power that they have, or that they can transfer to their offspring or to their group. And then, of course, there is Eleanor Olson, who got Nobel Prize on her work on designing institutions. So, your comments on this?
So that's how many hours have we got? So
you agree, but
yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right, and I agree. We agree on this thing, and that we're kind of, we're writing grants about such things at the moment. So I guess the point about stressing that we don't get to the result straight away is to justify why we need, or why we'd want to have an evolutionary approach at all, right? Because if we were able just to get to the solution straight away, design it, everything's, we don't need to have any kind of talk about any kind of evolutionary process there. We can just talk about psychological features and design, how that works. So that's the point about kind of emphasizing that we don't get things perfect straight away. And you're right, actually, the effect that getting some of the way there, having some kind of foresight that kind of guides us, it's a process of guided evolution. And in Pete's models that he's done before of cultural evolution, that's been a kind of an accepted factor, and it affects the rate of evolution, right? So if you can have guided variation, then you get to your peak on your adaptive landscape, another thing you like, you get there quicker, right? So, and then, I think some of the most interesting elements, as we talked about a little bit before, about this are when you've got different power, how do these power systems emerge in the first place? How does that affect what institutions play out? And then the last bit was about Ostrom, I think. And then, so Ellen Ostrom, big inspiration for a lot of the work we're doing in Kenya. So one of the things we're trying to do is to kind of map the existing institutions that these conservancies have to those design principles that Ostrom talks about. And there are other frameworks out there as well. It's actually interesting, kind of, at least in the context that we're dealing with, some of those kind of key principles haven't filtered through to how how conservation done by communities should play out. And there's actually a lot of emphasis on quite everyday features, like, have you got your checkbook in the head office of the conservancy? Are you filing your things correctly? Which are really, really important kind of day-to-day things to have. But they don't necessarily talk about kind of, the real design features, how does your monitoring system go? What are the, how effective are your punishment processes? And I think those are going to be kind of key things that really affect how well these different groups are doing in that system.
Thanks.
So we probably have time for maybe one more question. You have talked about how competition between groups has fostered the selection of more efficient institutions. Can you say something about the effects of within group competition relative to that, or between group competition?
Yeah. So I think I guess we've kind of been alluding to some of those things, and that kind of relates to you're going to have within these systems, within any kind of human group, you're going to have people with different motivations, different things affecting their preferences, and all these kind of things. And that's going to be really, really important. And Sergey has kind of developed some really cool modeling approaches to kind of incorporate that kind of individual variation. And it's going to be really, really important for kind of thinking about kind of the balance between these two levels, right? So, we, in the kind of in work that we've kind of done before, kind of around the kind of historical database, we kind of tried to look at this idea about kind of, I guess, kind of think about the balance of selection between different levels, how that might have shifted over time, and kind of what's one of the patterns kind of on against this kind of background of this, this broadly large increase in societies, or large scale increase in societies. You've got kind of inequality is doing different things at different times. Okay, so inequality can be quite variable in small scale societies. It's kind of bounded by just kind of the scope of it, but there is variation there. And then, but more prominently in modern day societies, this kind of distinction between the good and bad institutions. You've got some much more equal societies. We don't tend to talk about it as kind of egalitarian, but actually kind of more kind of inclusive societies are basically that you allow more of the people to take part in things. And so most economists or political scientists are thinking that's a fairly recent kind of invention, this kind of the spread of democracy that I talked about there. But there are also people who argue that it has its seeds in things that kind of go back much further, and could be thought about in the spread of pro-social religious things to do in kind of things to do 2,000 years ago. And there's some historical evidence and support of at least some of those ideas. So increasing scale and complexity is not doesn't always go hand in hand with inequality, and that's kind of one of the interesting things to explore.
And with that, I would like to remind everybody that next week we have Maria Lipinski from Health and Risk Communication Center at Michigan State University. That talk is going to be starting at 11:15 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time here in Knoxville, which is about a half hour earlier than we usually do. So I'll send out a reminder to everybody about that, and hopefully you'll be here to see that last talk in the series. Sergey, Peter, do you have anything you would like to say?
Just thank you very much, Tom, for the great talk.
Yes, thank you, Tom.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.